conflicts in human history. But what was Rome like before all that? How did it come into being? How did its early residents change it to make it a suitable place for them to live? Answering those questions might seem impossible since the answers are buried under millennia of occupation, but today's guest is better equipped to answer them than almost anybody in the world. Dr. Andrea Brock is an expert on the archaeology of archaic Rome and particularly on...
At the next stop sign, turn right.
She's a lecturer in classics at the University of St. Andrews, the director of the Center for Ancient Environmental Studies, and has excavated extensively in Rome itself, publishing numerous articles on her research in the process. Dr. Brock, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to get the chance to chat about the work that I've been doing.
So, how did you get interested in archaeology, and more specifically in the archaeology of the city of Rome?
So I started as a history major in undergrad, and...
At the stop sign, turn right onto Closter Dock Road.
I thought at the time that it was prudent to go on an archaeological field.
In 2.6 miles, turn right onto US 9W.
Just because I thought that this is what I was supposed to do, and I really loved the idea of traveling to Italy, so it was a win-win in that regard. I wasn't expecting to like it very much, but when I got to the field and I worked on my first excavation, I just fell in love. I really enjoyed being outside, being in nature. The physical labor was surprisingly rewarding, as well as the kind of teamwork atmosphere, you know, being with a lot of different people who are working hard throughout the day and then going back and eating and drinking hard in the evening. It was just a really fun experience for, you know, my undergraduate self. And so I realized then that I didn't want to give it up. And so after my first field school, I went back every summer for the next decade working on archaeological projects. And so I just immersed myself in archaeology, so shifting a bit away from history. Of course, a lot of what I do is still history, but you know, I'm focused much more in archaeological field work and the prehistoric period in particular. So this first excavation that I went on was at an Etruscan site, a site called Poggiacola, so not too far outside of Florence. And I was fascinated by the Etruscans. They're this early people in central Italy that, you know, they're still very mysterious because we can't really decipher their language so well. It's a non-Indo-European language that dies out, you know, in the ancient period. So they've left a really robust archaeological record, but they remain really mysterious. And so I was fascinated by the Etruscans, and that kind of led me ultimately to Rome and to early Rome as this peer city-state, a neighbor of the Etruscans. And so, you know, I kind of shifted gears from Etruria to early Rome in that way.
It's really interesting talking to a lot of archaeologists to hear just how much the culture of archaeology draws people in, as much as it is the individual topics, just the idea of being around people who are interested in the same stuff and collaborating, and like you said, like working hard and then having fun afterward. I mean, that's not really how historians function, to be totally honest. And so, like, I can see why archaeology would be more fun.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very different experience, especially in terms of the opportunity to make new discoveries.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say that historians aren't making new discoveries, certainly they are, but I mean, they do this, generally speaking, by looking at the set of data that we've long had, but applying new theories, new methodologies, new questions to that well-established body of knowledge. So by applying new theories or new questions, historians are able to write new histories. But for me, it was like the act of discovery and the actual production of new data that really just drew me into archaeology. And so once I started in that, I was unwilling to give it up.
At the next light, turn right.
I can see the attraction. I mean, like, I did my PhD in history, and I looked at every Latin language letter written between about 450 and 600 AD, and a lot of them were texts that people hadn't looked at that much before, but, like, they were still known things. Like, people have been reading these things for centuries. You couldn't convince me to go back and do that. Like, if I were going to do it all over again, I would 100% be an archaeologist. There's no
At the light, turn right onto US 9W.
I think all of us would love to read more, but life gets busy. We've got kids to ferry around to school and activities, we've got work, we've got all the obligations that come along with being adults. That's why I love Audible so much. Audible makes it easy to listen anytime, anywhere, while you're traveling, working out, walking, doing chores, anything. Audible's the home of storytelling, and it lets you enjoy all your audio entertainment in one app. You'll always find the best of what you love or something new, whether that's audiobooks, podcasts, or Audible originals. Right now, I'm listening to one of my very favorite popular histories, maybe the best one ever written, The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, her classic account of the beginning of World War I. Let Audible help you discover new ways to laugh, be inspired, or be entertained. New members can try it free for 30 days.
In 3/4 of a mile, turn right to merge onto Palisades Interstate Parkway South.
Audible.com/tides or text TIDES to 500-500. That's audible.com/tides or text TIDES to 500-500. Audible.com/tides. NetSuite by Oracle is the #1 cloud financial system that gives you the visibility and control you need to make better decisions faster. NetSuite is #1 because they give your business everything you need in real time, all in one place, to reduce manual processes, boost efficiency, build forecasts, and increase productivity across every department.
You continue straight, then use the right lane to turn right.
In NetSuite's 22 years, you can defer payments of a full NetSuite and
use the right lane to turn right.
For 6 months. 33,000.
Stay in the left 2 lanes.
Already upgraded to NetSuite, gaining visibility and control over their financials, inventory,
In 7 miles, exit left onto US 9W and Fletcher Avenue toward Fort Lee.
E-commerce and more. No interest, no payments. Take advantage of this special financing offer at netsuite.com/tides. netsuite.com/tides. So let's talk a little bit about Rome. What makes Rome a unique or uniquely difficult place in which to excavate?
Any kind of urban archaeology is inherently challenging. When there's a living city, you're going to have conflicts between kind of modernization while still, some desire of preserving cultural heritage. So, kind of any urban setting is going to create challenges. But in Rome, it's like magnified many times. In part because the city is so old. I mean, we're talking about urban occupation on the same spot of land for more than 2,500 years now. So that's really dense, intense human activity on this landscape. So that creates a lot of density of archaeological material and a lot of change over time, which can make things quite complicated. The other thing that makes Rome uniquely difficult is the topography. So of course Rome is known as a city of 7 hills, but between those hills are really deep valleys. And it's these valleys that have over time been filling, with sediment deposited by the Tiber River, filling with human activity, archaeological layers, so on and so forth. I mean, so when you're walking around the modern valleys of Rome on the street level, the archaeological record extends over 10 meters beneath your feet in some places. I mean, this is a really staggering depth, which makes it, on top of all of the other complications with operating in the middle of a bustling city, the depth of the archaeological remains make it really difficult to access. So, for example, I've had to work in trenches that are 5-6 meters deep. These are, practically speaking, very, very, very challenging, very expensive, because, when you're that deep, you're at risk of, the walls of the trench collapsing on you. So you have to have infrastructure put in place, with huge cranes lifting in, metal shoring walls, to brace your trench. And, I mean, so this gets extremely expensive, and it's really a very narrow place to work. So, you're very restricted. You're working at really great depth. And the part of the city where I work is very near to the Tiber River, so you're also grappling with the modern water table. So in this 5-meter deep trench that I excavated at the sanctuary of San Simobono some years ago, we had to have pumps running constantly just to suck the water out so that we could see what we were doing and do the excavation properly. So, I mean, it's just kind of a series of factors that make Rome really challenging for archaeological investigation.
So, I mean, I have so many questions that I want to ask you about that, but like as you're going down through the layers of occupation, I mean, can you see different layers as you're going down? Can you see medieval, you can see late antique, you can see imperial, all the way down to the archaic?
I mean, certainly you can. I mean, of course, it depends on where you're at and, you know, which part of the city. You know, it doesn't always help us that in the fascist period, the Romans themselves destroyed a lot of the, you know, the later phases to get down to the ancient levels again. So some parts of the city, a lot of the later archaeology or more modern archaeology has been destroyed by that fascist activity. But when it comes to actually working in a trench or kind of looking through a particular site, you absolutely can.
In 2 miles, exit left onto US 9W and Fletcher Avenue toward Fort Lee.
And if you're lucky, they're well dated, but you know that can be hit or miss sometimes.
I mean, that is incredible. I mean, I love thinking about how old Rome is and imagining different people at different points of Rome's history, like digging the foundations for something and just coming across random bits of the city's past. Like somebody putting up a new apartment building in the 2nd century AD, digging through 7th century BC graves and being like, what is that? Like, why is there all this bronze stuff in this grave? Like, I love imagining those people and thinking about their experience of the past of the city of Rome.
I think that's really astute, and you know, we have to appreciate that the Romans themselves, the ancients themselves, were very aware of the depth of their history. I mean, they were fascinated by their earliest forefathers, their archaic past. I mean, they told so many stories about their early city, even though a lot of it is imagination and myth. But I think a lot of it also stems from the phenomenon that you're describing, which is they're living on that land. So anytime they're destroying something to rebuild, or they're digging in a new place, or you know whatever they're doing, that's around.
Use the left 2 lanes to exit left onto US 9W and Fletcher Avenue toward Fort Lee.
They're kind of uncovering those earlier artifacts. So they're living in a kind of museum in a way, and they really appreciate that.
Exit left.
Their own fascination with their own history.
In half a mile, keep left toward Route 4 and US 46.
Yeah, it feels like one of the really striking things about, kind of to the extent that there is a quote-unquote Roman mentality, is like that awareness of the depth of their past and the way in which it shaped them in the present. And I mean, obviously they had their own ideas about these things, sometimes very
Keep left toward Route 4 and US 46.
That feels like a real strong constant throughout Roman history, and I hadn't really thought about it in connection with the landscape that they were living in, but that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I would actually say that their landscape, their cityscape...
In half a mile, turn left onto Kelby Street.
Huge impact on the way they conceive of their history, because Romans of the historical period, you know, thinking of Romans living in the Augustan age, for example, they're walking around their city and they can see structures that...
Go past this light, then at the next one, turn left.
Century BCE that date to the archaic period and look very archaic. And I think, you know, the average person on the street of Rome, again, you know, in the ancient period, would have recognized that this building looks very different from that building, and it looks very old. And so it's their landscape and I think their urban setting that preserves a lot of that history and makes it very real for them.
So, on that note, how much...
At the light, turn left onto Kelby Street, then keep left to merge onto New Jersey Turnpike North.
Know about the archaeology of early Rome, because you mentioned there are so many difficulties in trying to excavate there, layers of accretion, and then the ancient Romans' ideas themselves about what their city had been and why it looked the way it did. How much can we actually know about it?
Keep left. Continue straight, then use the right 2 lanes to take a slight right turn to merge onto New Jersey Turnpike North.
Well, I'd say now we can actually say a lot about early Rome.
Use the right 2 lanes to take a slight right turn to merge onto New Jersey Turnpike North.
This is the result of a lot of
In
work.
1.4 miles, take the exit to merge onto I-95 toward I-87.
Many decades. I mean, this started really in, archaeological investigations of early Rome started in like the late 19th century. Shortly after Rome was designated the capital of the newly established nation of Italy, so when Rome was designated the capital in 1871, shortly thereafter there were the first archaeological excavations, and so one of the pioneers of this work is a man named Giacomo Boni. And so Giacomo Boni, in part because of the unique archaeological record in Rome, becomes a kind of methodological forefather for this field because he's one of the first people to excavate stratigraphically. And it's because he's working in Rome's valleys that do have these layers of accretion over time that he recognizes and he documents. Again, he's a pioneer in this sense of stratigraphic excavation. And so, Rome being this place for...
Use the middle lane to take the exit to merge onto I-95 toward I-87.
And then also a place where you do have these really deep archaeological records allows it to be a place for really the growth of the discipline in a significant way. Now, of course, that early, that late 19th century...
Take the exit.
...work is pretty antiquated in a lot of ways. I mean, it was pioneering in some ways, but also limited. So that first round of work, for example, collected a lot of the artifacts that now fill many of the museums. So when you
Speed camera in 0.2 mile.
Take exit.
Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
from early Rome, like if you visit the Capitoline Museum in Rome or the Vatican Museum and you see a lot of these artifacts from the early city, a lot of it was produced in this kind of early wave of excavation. But in the
Exit left. Then keep left to merge onto Harlem River Drive toward Franklin Delano Roosevelt Drive. Keep left to merge onto Harlem River Drive toward Franklin Delano Roosevelt Drive.
I'd say like 30 years, there has been renewed work that's been done at much higher quality with far better scientific methods and dating. And so really in the last 30 years, we have collected ample new data and really reliable data on early Rome. And so the situation now, we can talk about the early city with a great deal more certainty now than we could have, let's say, 30 years ago. And so it's kind of a new era in some ways.
I'm fascinated by this for a couple of reasons, and I want to come back to the more recent work. But it's when you talk about the older stuff that was done in the 19th century, it's just a good reminder that archaeology is destructive, and that it's not like we can go back and reanalyze the spoil heaps from those excavations and go do flotation or like in some imagined future do sedimentary ancient DNA analysis, right? Like
In 11 miles, take exit 2 toward Manhattan Civic Center and Brooklyn Bridge.
And
we got some really cool stuff out of it, but those layers aren't coming back. You can't re-excavate them in the same way.
No, that is really key, and it creates a lot of frustrations for people like myself because I have to rely on notes and drawings that were made from these early excavations. But unfortunately, the artifacts that were collected were very few. Unless it was like a beautiful sculpture or a precious metal, those things were certainly saved. But the kind of broken little piece of ceramic sherd, oftentimes these were not collected very extensively, or maybe just a couple of examples were collected. But it's those ceramic sherds, even tiny little fragmentary bits of ceramic, that provide really reliable dates. And so it's the ceramic evidence that archaeologists like myself rely on heavily now. But back in the late 19th century, they thought, well, this looks kind of crappy. This is just a little fragment, a little broken potsherd. Let's toss it. And unfortunately, as you say, like if they didn't collect the data, it's now lost to us.
I was thinking about that recently because I did an episode on the Etruscans, and I was thinking about the early excavations of ancient DNA analysis around isotope analysis, paleopathological analysis, and what a rich source of data that would be, and it's just gone because they didn't think the votes mattered.
Yeah, and I mean, this problem persists, across so many different types of sampling that they could have done. But, this is a reality.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Archaeologists of the modern day, should seek not to destroy
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Part of it is protected completely for future generations, for future scientific discoveries. They don't want to excavate it all now. They want to preserve some of that record for the next generations of archaeologists who have better techniques that can bring to bear on a record that hasn't been disturbed.
For most of us, learning a second language in high school or college wasn't exactly a high point in our academic careers. And I'm talking to you, everybody who rolled in hungover to a 9 o'clock German class in college. Now, thanks to Babbel, the language learning app that sold more than 10 million subscriptions, there's an addictively fun and easy way to learn a new language. Whether you'll be traveling abroad, connecting in a deeper way with family, or you just have some free time, Babbel teaches bite-sized language lessons that you'll actually use in the real world. I've learned lots of languages over the course of my life, but I find it pretty hard to stay brushed up on them. Babbel is great for reminding me about the things I've forgotten in Spanish. Babbel's 15-minute lessons make it the perfect way to learn a new language on the go. The expertly crafted lessons are built around real life. You'll learn how to have practical conversations about travel, relationships, business, and more. Right now, when you purchase a 3-month Babbel subscription, you'll get an additional 3 months for free. That's 6 months for the price of 3. Just go to babbel.com and use promo code TIDES. That's BABBEL.com, code TIDES. Spring is in bloom and you know what comes next, vacation season. But before you pack your bags, be sure to secure your home with SimpliSafe Home Security. With SimpliSafe, enjoy greater peace of mind knowing your home is monitored around the clock by trained agents, ready to act to defend against break-ins, fires, and other threats. I love SimpliSafe because it is so easy to use. What is the point of having a security system if it's too complicated for you to use it? With the top-rated SimpliSafe app, you can stay connected from anywhere, anytime. Arm or disarm your system remotely, you can check your cameras to make sure everything is okay, you can even unlock the front door to let a guest in. SimpliSafe ships right to your door, and it's easy to set up yourself in about 30 minutes, or you can have SimpliSafe's certified technicians install it for you. With financing through a firm, you can secure your home today and pay over time in installments that fit your budget. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplisafe.com/tides. Go today and claim a free indoor security camera plus 20% off your order with interactive monitoring. That's simplisafe.com/tides. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. So speaking of brand new techniques, I want to talk about your coring project. I'm absolutely fascinated by this. How does this work?
Well, it can happen at many different scales, and so at the smallest scale, it can be kind of handheld, with a little auger, and you're just kind of making a little, a very shallow core. The kind of coring work that I do, because I'm in Rome, is actually much larger. So I am using large machinery. So this is work that's actually contracted out to geophysical experts. So it's the kind of machinery, for example, that's used typically when they're going to build a new building and you want to test the bedrock, let's say. So you drill some cores and to see, where is bedrock and what is bedrock made of, and so they can better plan on how to construct the building. So it's that kind of equipment that's typically employed for that kind of work. For me, what I do is, I hire these contractors that bring in this big machinery, and what it does is drill through the street level. So this is very powerful machinery that can drill through almost anything, concrete and hard stone, and it drills very, very deep. So my cores in the region that I work on the riverbank in the Forum Valarium, they go and then it produces a sediment core. So these cores are usually around 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter. So we're talking about a really narrow but deep slice of the archaeological and geological stratigraphy. So I'm not getting anything like big architectural features or even big artifacts. It's all really fragmentary artifacts, or I've cored through a wall of, so I get like a cylinder of stone, but then the rest of it is all sediment. So whether that's sediment deposited by the river or sediment deposited by human activity, I get a view of the stratigraphy in that 15-meter deep slice of that one core. And then we take that machinery and we move around, and so we'll do this in many different places. So we don't just take one slice, but we take 20 slices, and then we can compare the stratigraphy across those cores to kind of reconstruct the landscape, understand the stratigraphy more broadly.
So when you have those cores, you take them back to the lab, and then you're looking at each of the distinct layers to see what you find. So what kind of stuff can you look for?
So once the drilling work is done, the sediment cores are put in plastic tubes and kind of wrapped up just to protect them, and then brought to my lab space. And then so I lay them all out, and then I look at them one by one, and they're broken into 1 meter chunks. So you can move them, carrying them in your arms. So I'll look at 1 meter chunks at a time, and I do a similar analysis that you would do on any excavation, which is studying the stratigraphy, describing the stratigraphy. What does the sediment consist of? Is this clay? Is this sand? What kind of inclusions do you find? Whether those are natural inclusions or whether those are artifacts. So I kind of go through an initial process of analyzing the boreholes, stratigraphically, photographing them, drawing them, collecting those visible artifacts. And then, we perform a series of sampling processes. So one thing is flotation. So flotation is a big thing in order to collect macrobotanical remains in particular, so seeds or charcoals. So we'll take, chunks of sediment out of the cores and then send them off for flotation in order to collect that botanical material. And then collect other things as well, depending on, the research questions and the kind of sampling that we want to do. Another thing that we've done is pollen analysis. So collecting samples that are then sent to a lab to look at under a microscope to count the pollen grains. So suffice it to say, this is the kind of work that I absolutely could not do by myself. It really requires an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach, and I've been really fortunate throughout my time pouring in Rome to work
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Scientists who are really keen to come look at the cores with me, think about what we're seeing, think about how we should sample, what we should test, what kind of questions should we ask of this really rich data set. And it's only through that collaborative process and through the input of so many wonderful colleagues that the project has been as successful as it is.
The work that you've produced on this basis is fascinating, and I had to explain this because I'm working on a book on prehistory right now, and some of the sites I'm working with are literally just dirt. Like, there's not even any artifacts, it's just sediments. And I'm on a call with my book editor, and I'm trying to explain, I promise the dirt's exciting. I promise there's cool stuff in the dirt. and but nothing illustrates that better than these cores, because you're getting an entire cross-section of the entire history of the city, going all the way back to the beginning of human occupation there. I mean, that is an incredible kind of record to have.
It is really incredible. It's overwhelming at times. I mean, especially in the beginning.
In 2 miles, take exit 2 toward Manhattan Civic Center and Brooklyn Bridge.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour. Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Because I really am just looking at dirt, by and large. Most of what I look at is sediment deposited by the Tiber River, and then, eventually archaeological levels. But these, they don't make any sense like you would make sense of an excavation, where you can see the building or the deposit.
Red light camera in 0.1 mile.
This is such a narrow slice that if I can't make connections between the other cores, I really am very lost. And so it's only until the post-field work analysis, where we get all of the ceramics analyzed and dated, and all of the radiocarbon dating performed, where I can start to make sense of, okay, this is where I'm at, and this is how I can relate.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
It has proven to be the most exciting type of research that I've found, and I've just absolutely become obsessed with it.
No, I mean, it's like shining a tiny little flashlight into a giant dark room.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per
A
hour.
lot of beams, and you can start to break down what you see in every part of the beam. Then it makes some sense. But I mean, I like it's hard to overstate.
Use the right 2 lanes to take exit 2 toward Civic Center and Brooklyn Bridge.
Just how exciting the implications of the work are. And so I'll turn to that a little bit. What exactly does this tell us about Rome's past? Like, what have we learned from looking at these groups?
So, my work has been focused largely on the Riverbank district.
Take the exit, then keep left.
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
So,
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
cool to do, and again, not just myself, but my collaborators as well and colleagues. Our work together has allowed us to present a reconstruction of what the landscape looked like prior to the beginning of the city. So we have to appreciate that the process of urbanizing at the site of Rome, the process of building the city, changed the landscape really dramatically. And this is especially apparent in the River Valley district. So, for example, we have been able to show that in the early 6th century, so
Continue on to Brooklyn Bridge.
to the beginning of really intensive urbanization on the site.
In 1.7 miles, turn left onto Livingston Street.
Rome's River Valley was a very opportunistic place, a very advantageous place, in the sense that the landscape reconstruction seems to suggest that this area was well suited to early harbor and fording activity. So, this would have been a place where people could access the Tiber River, enter and exit the Tiber River, and it just seems to have been really well suited to supporting an abundance of early settlement activity. And so this is, a vision of early Rome that for a long time has just been in our imagination. I mean, again, the ancient Romans themselves told stories about what their early landscape was. Turns out that they didn't really get it quite right, as you might expect. But kind of jumping to the modern period, scholars have also had questions about, well, what was the landscape of early Rome?
Stay in the left lane.
Made a lot of assumptions, largely drawn from the literary record, which is problematic. The literary record for Rome doesn't really kick off until the 3rd century BCE. So, when you're talking 6th century BCE, there's a really sizable gap there that you don't have historical records. So modern scholars seeking to understand Rome's origins have again, relied on the literary record, made a lot of assumptions. One common assumption that you see so much in the literature on Rome is that the early city had a bunch of marshes. And again, this is a notion that comes from the ancient literary record, but you see it just kind of tossed out in almost any description of Rome's landscape. It had high hills.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
It was a watery landscape. This notion that, this would have been a really difficult place to inhabit. Well, the coring survey has pretty much...
Stay in the 2nd lane from right.
There was not a marsh in early Rome, or at least not an expansive, widespread one. In fact, we have found evidence of a swamp-like feature, but it dates to the Neolithic period. So there was a swamp in early Rome, but this is millennia before the beginnings of sedentary habitation on the site. By the time people were settling the hills of Rome in the late Bronze Age, Rome's river valley was a seasonally inundated floodplain, not a permanently wet marsh.
In a quarter mile, turn right onto Flatbush Avenue Extension.
A floodplain that, for the vast majority of the year, would have been really suitable to an abundance of activity. Again, people coming up the river from the Mediterranean Sea, pulling their boats ashore at the kind of foot of the Palatine and Capitoline Hills and unloading wares. This is how a lot of the important goods would have been moving around the landscape. I mean, so, we can kind of imagine Rome's landscape as like a natural funnel, in that the river provided a really important means of early transportation, and Rome is there sitting, just on the Tiber shore with a floodplain that most of the year would have been very suited to a wide variety of markets and social activities. So the coring has allowed us to better understand the
At the next light, turn right.
is kind of at the beginning of settlement activity at the site of Rome. The other thing that the cores demonstrate
At the
is
light, turn right onto Flatbush Avenue Extension.
that this was not a stable, static landscape. As Rome was urbanizing intensely in the course of the 6th century BCE, the cores show that the river valley changed dramatically. I mean, we're talking 5.8 meters of sediment deposited in the area of Rome's archaic harbor in the course of the 6th century alone. This is tons of sediment. This is new activity from the Tiber River, so new floodwaters bringing new levels of sediment to the valley, actually changing the topography in a really significant way. So whereas the early inhabitants of Rome had a really advantageous river valley where arguably they could have carried out a number of activities associated with the river, over the course of the 6th century, their river valley becomes silted up and much, much, much more flood prone. So basically,
In 1.4 miles, turn right onto 7th Avenue.
Rome is urbanizing, the river valley is changing dramatically. And this is a vision of early Rome that we've never had before. This idea that they are changing, but their environment is changing, and they're reacting to everything in the moment. And this is all in prehistory. I mean, this is all well before the advent of the historical record. So it's really only through archaeology and geoarchaeology that we can talk about this.
So why did the landscape start to change so dramatically in that period of time? Were these natural processes connected to changing climatic conditions? Were they anthropogenic? I mean, or is it some combination of the two? Why did the Tiber change its behavior so much?
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic question, and one that I'm still working on. And the reality is that trying to make an argument about why a river changes its behavior is really complex, because rivers are very dynamic forces. Rivers meander and shift their banks and create new floodplains all the time, just naturally occurring behavior. So it's really hard to say this is the cause. I think it's important to acknowledge the possibility of climactic changes. So we don't really have good data for this, but in theory, you might say, well, if in the 6th century you get a sudden pulse of intense precipitation, that creates perhaps more erosion of sediment in the catchment area, and then that sediment is then ultimately deposited in the lower stretches of the valley. Now that's a possibility, but again, we don't really have the climactic data to make a one-to-one correlation. Now, what I would say is that what we do know is certainly happening is a tremendous amount of urban construction in the 6th century. So the archaeology of early Rome, and again, a lot of the work that's happened over the last 3 decades, has shown for us quite conclusively that this period marks the beginning of monumental constructions, stone-based constructions, terracotta roof constructions. This is really the beginning of the city, whereas prior to the 6th century, it's much smaller scale, mud brick base, thatch roof, scattered habitation. It seems much less substantial. But in the 6th century, you get legitimately urbanizing activity, and that's demonstrated by the archaeological record. So someone like myself would say we should expect that it's going to have implications for the river valley. So, for example, in order to build these buildings, in order to fire the clay to make the roofs, they would have had to use a lot of timber resources. So timber is a really, really expensive.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Across cultures, it's common to conduct deforestation activities along a river valley, when the resources are there, because you can, kind of just cut down the trees and then send the logs downriver. So if you were to deforest a river valley, again, it's going to release a lot of sediment into the river, and then that's going to settle in the lower stretches. I would say that we know they're urbanizing on a really monumental scale, and we should probably assume or argue that this urbanization activity had larger implications for the broader landscape. Now, ideally, I would have something like pollen data to prove deforestation hypothesis like that, but we lack pollen data for this period in Rome, so it's a little bit more of a conjecture. It's an argument that I have to make, but I think it's a logical one. I think it's fair to say that the amount of sedimentation that we can see in Rome's river valley starting in the 6th century must have had some cause by the human activity on the local and or regional landscape.
What would you do to save humanity, and how far would you go to stop someone?
In half a mile, turn right onto 7th Avenue. Stay in the middle lane.
The ancient rivalry
25 mile per hour speed limit, camera ahead.
Templars cuts to the heart of good versus evil, and it's not always clear who is right and who is wrong. Travel to and explore the captivating world of medieval feuds in the historical podcast, Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars, a special collaboration between History Hit and Ubisoft, the masterminds behind the Assassin's Creed games. Hosted by Dan Snow from History Hit and Matt Lewis from Gone Medieval, the 8-episode season will take a close look at the real history of the secret societies, which inspired the Assassin's Brotherhood and the Templar Order in the Assassin's Creed games. Every episode, they are joined by other premier historians to do a deep dive into the Crusades, unearthing the myths of the Grail and discovering the real people who inspired key characters of the game. Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars podcast is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. Listen and subscribe to Echoes of History today to discover the hidden truths that have shaped our world and inspired the video game series. That's Echoes of History wherever you get your podcasts. Listen today and subscribe for more. Yeah, I mean, this is a period of tremendous population growth, right? By just about any metric that you can look at in Rome itself and in the surrounding area. I mean, the settlement record is showing that the countryside is filling
At the
up.
light, turn right onto Prospect Place, then turn left onto 5th Avenue.
More settlements.
At the next light, turn left.
Just more people around, we can expect them to be using their kind of local resources more heavily, to be straining their resources. Like, I mean, because before that, like the 9th,
At
8th,
the light, turn left onto 5th Avenue.
centuries seem fairly stable in a lot of ways in that region, if I'm remembering the record correctly. But when you get into the 6th century and you have a fairly sudden jump, like, things are going to change, and you can't always be sure how they're going to change.
Absolutely, and I think this is really important context because we need to understand what's happening in early Rome by contextualizing it with what's happening more broadly. And you're absolutely right that the survey evidence, this part of central Italy is one of the most intensely surveyed parts of the world. And so really decades and decades of field walking archaeological survey allows us to contextualize what's happening at Rome with what's happening in the broader region, especially in Etruria and Latium. And there is a lot of urban growth happening. It's not just at Rome. But Rome is interesting because it's right there on the Tiber River. Most of the habitations that we see, most of the kind of pier city-states, pier communities, seem to be focused on kind of highland areas, so like volcanic plateaus or the tops of hills. And Rome, of course, Rome has its hills as well, but Rome is absolutely inhabiting the lowland, and we see this archaeologically. The first temple that we know of archaeologically from Rome is right on the riverbank. So it's in the lowland. This is the early 6th century temple from the sanctuary of San Smobono. This is actually the what I was excavating when I was talking about that 5-meter deep trench. We were working so hard in order to get at the first ever temple built in Rome. So it was pretty exciting. But so that temple has been really thoroughly studied. We know very well that it dates to the early 6th century. So we are very early in the city's history, and they are putting that temple right beside the river. So they clearly have an interest in occupying the lowland.
Continuous recording will now start. GPS connected.
Starting route to home.
Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. Before Alexander Hamilton became the most popular historical celebrity of the 20-teens, thanks to the release of the hit Broadway musical Hamilton, the biggest historical celebrity of the early 20th century was Joan of Arc. Flappers copied her short hairstyle, silent movies were made about her, and she was the unofficial symbol of suffragettes. But what's interesting is that many of them didn't glom onto her image because she was somehow pushing back against an oppressive male order during the High Middle Ages, but rather because she represented a time in history when women had more rights than they did in the 20th century. Well, this might seem odd because today a lot of people consider the Middle Ages as a bloodthirsty time of Vikings, saints and kings, the male-dominated society that oppressed and excluded women. Today's guest, Janina Ramirez, argues that that is not the case at all. She's the author of the new book Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages through the women written out of it. She argues that what we see are women having striking influence all throughout the medieval period, from Athelflaed and Athelwyn, back-to-back female rulers in Anglo-Saxon England, to the designers of the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most important historical artifacts we have. It tells us all sorts of things about the Norman conquest of England.
At the next light, turn right.
Scientist Hildegard of Bingen, writer, composer, philosopher, and mystic, and considered to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. Now, none of this means that the Middle Ages were some sort of...
At the light, turn right onto 4th Avenue.
Punk feminist utopia. This was still a very hierarchical period, and that included gender expression, but still, many of the ideas we have about the period are flat out wrong, thinking that everyone was in poverty and thought that the world was flat, and this is another example of that. We discover a lot of people who've been left out of our collective memories about the past, so I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Yanina Ramirez. And one more thing before we get started with this episode, a quick break for a word from our sponsors.
At Post University, you will have educators and advisors springing into action to provide you with personal support. Because whatever your goals, whether you're online, on campus, or both, support means everything. See how support is helping people like you succeed and start your path now at post.edu/support. That's post.edu/support.
Your book opens with a story...
In a quarter mile, turn left onto Atlantic Avenue.
Radical suffragette Emily Wilding Davidson, who went on protests and hunger strikes, and she ultimately appears to commit suicide in a public horse race in 1918. And there's a lot we can say about her remarkable life, but what is interesting to note is that she was also a medievalist. And one might think, oh, that's interesting that a protester for women's rights is so interested in a period that we would think to be highly male-dominated. But this contradiction unravels when you look at her life, where she is inspired by...
Go past this light, then at the next one, turn left.
So, could you tell her about how the view of the Middle Ages to suffragettes like her would surprise us, and what larger point does this make about the Middle Ages?
Oh, it's a great question, Scott. I mean, for me, when I discovered the medieval connection with Emily Wilding Davison, it was a eureka moment in terms of writing the book, because at the time, my daughter, she's 11, and she had been doing the suffragettes at school, and she came home and she said, "Mummy, isn't it amazing how, thanks to what these women did 100 years ago, we've got the vote, we've got equal rights, we've got all these great things going on for us, which we've never had before. Wasn't that incredible?" And I've always sort of subscribed to that view too. But I think that's the problem of looking at contemporary history, modern history, from where we are backwards, as opposed to understanding that the people making history are not doing it in a vacuum. They're doing it against the context of what's come before. So, I mean, Emily Wilding Davison is so well known in the UK. Her funeral was one of the most highly attended non-royal funerals of all time. She had 50,000 people lined the streets to watch her casket being carried through London, and it was taken as a galvanizing point for the suffragette movement. Up until 1913, it had been floundering somewhat. You had the suffragists and the suffragettes. The suffragists being increasingly silenced in their political...
At the light, use the left 2 lanes to turn onto Atlantic Avenue.
To get suffrage, and then the suffragettes becoming increasingly militant. I mean, Emily Wilding Davison in particular, she was one of the most militant. She was blowing up letterboxes, and as you say, she went on hunger strike multiple times, which is a incredibly violent process to be force-fed within prisons. So that was happening, but they really were losing public support. They were losing momentum, and we don't know exactly the circumstances behind what happened at the 1913 Derby in Epsom, but I mean, it seems that Emily...
In 3/4 of a mile, take a slight right turn onto Borum Place.
She'd made plans to go away with her sister in the next following days, so was it a martyr's mission? I don't know.
But little known to anybody, she was supposed to be at the suffragette fair, where incidentally, I love this, I found a postcard of the 1913 suffragette fair, and the main entrance was this megalithic statue of Joan of Arc standing over the entrance with the banner, fight on and God will give me victory. And so she was supposed to be there, but she ends up at Epsom. And what's interesting about this particular derby is it's being captured on film. It's going to be shown around the Commonwealth in cinemas. And
In half a mile, take a slight right turn onto Bourne Place.
everything's going fine. The crowds are pressed up against the white banner. Then the horses reach Tettenham Corner. And there's two parts in the horses. The first part are racing ahead, then there's a small gap. And the first hop in the second gap is the King's horse, Anma. And he's wearing the King's coat of arms, the King's colour. The King that is there in the stands watching the race. And Emily dives under the barrier. She walks quite slowly. It's eerie footage to watch. And she reaches up towards this moving horse. This horse is going at sort of 50, 60 kilometres an hour. And what she seems to be trying to do is tie a suffragette's banner onto the horse, or throw it onto the horse. But then in the kerfuffle, the horse, somehow she gets hit. She falls to the ground. The rider falls off the horse. The horse gets up and finishes the race. But the rider and Emily are left unconscious on the racecourse. He can go on to ride again, but he never fully recovers from the incident. He goes on to commit suicide somewhat later. But Emily lies in hospital unconscious. She then dies of her injuries, but in the meantime, she's become this hugely divisive figure. Some people absolutely despise her for ruining, the most important sporting events of the year. She's getting hate mail. And then others, the suffragettes, say, look, we have our martyr, we have our death to the cause. So I knew a lot about Emily, and I was very interested in her. But honestly, when I started researching her, she was a footnote on a footnote that she'd studied medieval literature. And the more I delved in, I realised that she'd done the equivalent of a degree in medieval literature, which is what I had done at university. And like me, she was at Oxford, as she wasn't allowed to graduate. Newspaper articles, academic articles, where she builds up this picture of the medieval period that she has developed from reading Chaucer, from reading all the different historical sources of the time. And what she argues is what blew my mind. She says, we women, we suffragettes in the Victorian Edwardian period, we have been denied rights recently that women had before us. We want to go back to a medieval period where women had agency, women had a voice, women felt empowered. And as soon as I read that, I thought, focus, they're not operating in a vacuum. They're looking backwards for power that they've had denied to them. And that was the point where my understanding of this topic changed.
Well, right, there's a lot to dive into there, and I suppose really briefly, Joan of Arc herself is a useful person to look at, and the image of her in the early 20th century, I suppose at this time period in the 19-teens, 1920s, the way she's perceived is sort of like the way Alexander Hamilton was in the 20-teens in the United States and elsewhere after the stage play Hamilton went on fire. That there's the silent movie 1900 Joan of Arc. The short hairstyle is popular among flappers in the 1920s. So what is her, symbolically, what does she represent to women in this time period?
Well, this is so interesting.
Go past this light, then use the right lane to take a slight right turn onto Bourne Place.
Right, but so often the way we cast our historical figures is a representation of our present day concerns and interests, isn't it? So, she's become a vehicle for so many different types. I mean, in Femina, I talk about the Burka warrior women and Viking warriors, and this idea of fighting women that we kind of are open to understanding now with computer games or with different sort of genres of superhero movies, this idea that a woman can fight. So, are we reflecting our own interests backwards? I think with the suffragettes, the reason that Joan of Arc was so perfect as a figurehead was twofold. On the one hand, she was this androgynous being, it's having looked at the works of Froissart when I was working on the 100 Years' War, it's fascinating how she is depicted, because you see this figure who in the initial illustrations has this long glowing blonde hair sort of down to her knees, and then as soon as she's given the coat of armor, she looks like this male warrior. She's transformed into this sort of dual role of woman and warrior. So for militants, for the deeds not words branch.
In a quarter mile, keep left onto Adams Street.
Suffragettes movement. She is the ultimate doer, isn't she? But the second reason that she's so attractive to the suffragettes is her piety. One of the things we forget, I think, because we are increasingly secular in the way we view the past, the suffragettes were deeply religious, and so much of what they did was framed within religious terminology. So Joan was a mystic. She's visited by saints. She's divinely inspired. So that gave their movement that sense of being righteous, of being kind of what God intends as well. So yeah, she was a singularly perfect kind of figurehead.
Well, that is as good of any launching point into the past, and I think one of the best entry points is to look at female monarchs, female rulers, and power holders. And one fascinating case is one of the few instances in the medieval era of female to female succession, which is a female queen followed by another female ruler. Let's look at this time period in history, and some of my listeners who are fans of British royalty might be thinking, ooh, I know what they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about...
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Then use the left 2 lanes to keep left onto Adams Street.
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
What is happening in this period?
In 1.6 miles, keep right toward FD River Drive North.
What are the social conditions where you think a female-to-female succession is possible?
Well, it's really interesting you say there, Scott, about going in with royals, and I know there is this sort of global fascination with English royalty. I deliberately, when I was writing this book, was trying to steer clear of making it all about power players. I wanted it to be a kind of cross-section of society, and I really tried hard, because obviously it's easier to find out about the rich, the powerful, the elites. They leave behind more breadcrumbs. It's much harder to find out about tradeswomen, about women from lower classes, different racial backgrounds. But I try and do all of that in the book. But I did give myself 2 concessions. One was King Jadwiga of Poland. So the ruler, it's a very fascinating instance of the terminology being unique. So only her and her sister Mary in the 14th century, they're the only Western women to have the title of Rex, not Regina. So king, not queen. So I included her, and then yes, I did give myself a little bit of leeway to discuss queenship, rulership in the early medieval period, in the Anglo-Saxon period. And what I was trying to show with Athelflaed, so she's never actually known as Queen Athelflaed. She's known as Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. And the ruler, the king at this point, is her brother, Edward. So we're talking the end of the 9th century. Now, she's probably better known as the daughter of Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to have this addition of great to his name. And I've always been fascinated by Alfred. I've always found him to be, a singularly inspired ruler. He was equally concerned with military tactics. It's down to him that the whole of the British Isles doesn't become an outpost of Scandinavia at this point. But he's also fascinated by civic planning. He comes up with this Burgle system, this idea of kind of protected towns that we still have as the basis of our town system here in England. But he was also very aware that you cannot have future progress and future growth without education and culture and art. So he invested heavily in, this is a thing I'm sure we'll talk about more, but this idea of the church. He split his income, the national income, between the state, as in military awards and civic planning, and the church. But the church as a branch, or under that, what you've got are monasteries, convents, schooling. These places are the universities, the hospitals, the research academies, the art centres of the medieval period. So by investing in those, he's investing in culture as well. So I always found him fascinating, but his daughter was somewhat overlooked. And this is because what I found really interesting in writing this book is there are different ways that women have been written out of the narrative, written out of the story. Sometimes it's deliberate book burning. Obviously, we know with the Reformation that there is the destruction of many, many books. And my title, Femina, comes from the destruction of women's books. in that process, but there are more sort of accidental forgetting of women, where if you want to look at the narratives of the 18th, 19th century, narratives of colonialism, expansion, industrialism, war, those narratives don't need women in them, and so they sort of get forgotten, they get ignored. But then you have something like the story of Athelflaed, which is a woman being written out of the story in her own lifetime, pretty much. And that's happening due to her brother. What he realizes is that Athelflaed has grown up, again, looking backwards, to a tradition of Mercian women that have wielded unique rights and powers in their lifetimes. So Anglo-Saxon England, going through the 7th, 8th, 9th century, it's split up into these major kingdoms. The sort of powerhouse that we're talking about at this point is Wessex in the south. But their next door neighbours, Mercia, going up into the Midlands, are equally powerful, if not more so, in the previous centuries. So Athelflaed knows if she can become a lady of the Mercians, she can have more power than her own mother has as Queen of Mercia. She can have the sort of authority that really is rivaled only by rulers in the east, in the Ottoman Empire. She marries this elderly warrior, Ethelred. He dies, and when he dies, she assumes complete power. She is elected by the Witan, by her own people, to rule them. And as you mentioned, it's the only example, really, of a mother handing down her role, her regal responsibilities to her daughter, Alfwin. And, of course, Alfwin's reign is short-lived. Her uncle, Edward, strides in and says, hang on a minute, no, we're not having this, I'm having your position in Mercia, and you're going to a convent. So it's a short-lived victory, but a victory nonetheless, and boy, is she a fascinating leader. I mean, she takes everything her father does and sort of amplifies it, does it on a national scale. And if she hadn't have died unexpectedly on the eve of battle in York, she would have been the reunifier of England as we know it today.
I'm glad you mentioned earlier about not just restricting yourself to political leaders, because I agree. I think it hampers our idea of what power is and how it's projected, and also really thinking about who's had long-term influence. And people have had influence over multiple centuries. Both male and female are arguably writers. So most important works of medieval history from the medieval period is the Alexiad by Anna Comnene, and religious writers in particular are still influencing many adherents. So let's talk about a few of them. Can you tell us about Julian of Norwich and why you think she's influential but also overlooked?
I think you're absolutely right there about this idea of writing being, and we know it, Shakespeare reinforces it, doesn't it? You write your name upon a strand. It's the way of defeating time. And one of the major problems with framing up on women in the medieval period, and you know, when I started this book, there's another big book that come out about the Anglo-Saxons, and it opens with the statement, this book will not feature the lives of medieval women because they are impossible to recover.
Use the right 2 lanes to keep right toward FD River Drive North.
From the period, and I thought, no, they're not. But one of the things they are very, very difficult to recover from is the textual record. If we layer it up with archaeology, with art history, with cultural history, we can find them. But there are a few that stand out.
Keep right, then keep right to merge onto South Street Viaduct.
Kind of defeated the passage of time by having their texts preserved, and often their texts are preserved against all the odds. And one of those is Julian of Norwich, and she lived...
Keep right to merge onto South Street Viaduct.
At the end of the 14th century, on the eastern side of England in Norwich, she lived the first part of her life, I think, in quite a traditional sort of way for women at this point. She was part of a merchant's family, it seems. She certainly, Norwich and King's Lynn, this area, was a bustling part of the Hanseatic League. So trade, wool in particular, wool and fabrics, but lots of international trade going on, ships buzzing in and out of the port from the Netherlands, many languages being spoken in and around them, and women having a vibrant role within this world. You're getting involved in brewing, getting involved in running mills and running shops, and actually, being involved in the guilds as well. So that's the first half of Julian's life, and it's most likely, reading her text closely, that she had a family, she had children, But what beset her during her lifetime was really an extraordinary amount of challenges. First off, you had heretical practices, particularly the Lollards were being persecuted. So you had burning of heretics taking place. You had war on the continent, 100 Years' War is still raging, and you had a schism in the church.
In 11 miles, take exit 24 on the left to merge onto US, 1 south toward I-95 south.
Papacy was split. So on both the sort of secular and the sacred level, people were extremely confused, and there was a lot of movement of people, men, young soldiers being shipped off abroad, either to fight the schism or to fight the national wars. And in the midst of all of this comes the Black Death and then its subsequent plagues. So Julian's life, it really comes at this pivotal moment in history. And she, it seems, loses her family, either to the first wave of the Black Death or its subsequent waves, which are particularly virulent for children. So she is left alone, and she herself contracts the plague, and she is lying on her deathbed, and she has lost complete movement of her body. The only thing she can move are her eyes. And at this point, she's given the last rites by a priest, and he holds up a crucifix over her face. And she looks at this crucifix, and in her sort of feverish state, she undergoes these series of visions, and they are so remarkable. I mean, in a world that doesn't understand the concept of cinematic film, what Julian describes is cinema. It's vivid. You're sort of plunging through the wound in Christ's side. You're sweeping over Calvary and looking down through a bird's eye view on the crucifixion. It's so like vivid. So she has lived these visions. She survives, and as a result, she then requests to be held up as an anchoress. This is a lot of people, when I tell my students, like, who would ever choose that? She gets hauled up in a single room, given the last rites, and she's not allowed to leave that room for the rest of her life. But again, we've just lived through a global pandemic. This idea of being kind of put inside while there's pestilence and war and all sorts outside, I think maybe we could relate to that a little bit more now than we could have done, say, 5 years ago. But within this room, she has autonomy. You know, she's taken out of the world of child rearing, of house running, of cleaning, cooking, being in the domestic sphere. But she also doesn't have to enter the monastic environment where, you know, she's conducted by the hours of the day, where she has to work for the community and run the land, till the land. And she spends, it could be anything up to 3 decades in this space, writing this book called The Revelations of Divine Love. And it goes through a number of different permutations. Luckily, 2 different versions of her text survive. One that's known as the short text, which is the earlier version, and then the long text, which is the better known version, which shows that over the course of those years, she returned to these visions, she returned to these ideas. And it is such a fascinating text. I made a BBC documentary about searching for the lost manuscript. You know, how has this manuscript survived? Is the original manuscript out there somewhere in someone's attic or in a library somewhere? But what I found in making that documentary, her text was preserved by a set of quite maverick 17th century English nuns who, between the ages of 21 and 18, they set up a convent in France, and there they recorded texts that were sort of chiming with their philosophy of life. And they repeatedly copied out Julian's Revelations of Divine Love. And it is a uniquely feminine theology. It's nurturing. God is a mother. There's lots of gentle domestic imagery in it. But it's also, it's got this steady gaze. You know, the famous phrase she's known for is, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And in some circumstances, that might sound like a sort of truism, something blasé, oh, it'll all be okay tomorrow. But in Julian's work, in this sort of radiating spider's web of a work, it just sounds like a steady gaze that, don't worry, it will be okay. So it's a uniquely consoling text. And when I was making the documentary, we interviewed many, many people who've been affected by her work. And some of them had lost children, some of them were battling cancer, some of them were dealing with grief. And they just found in this text something unique, something you don't find in anything else. So, yeah, she should be more widely known. But I think her moment in the light is coming. You know, people are hearing about her.
The anchoresses are a great example of wielding power in unexpected ways. It's a great example of Weapons of the Weak, the great James C. Scott book about unexpected ways people use power. I mean, you're committing your life to prayer and study, but doesn't mean you can't talk to the public. People could still seek you out for advice, for informal confession, maybe want to hear the latest news, hear gossip. If you're enterprising like Catherine of Siena, you can use your focal point in the community to launch humanitarian relief during the plague, and as an even larger launching point of bringing the papacy back to Rome. Actually, I want to bring it back a larger point of, I think sometimes when people look at highly influential female religious leaders, if you're someone who's very sloppy with his research of the Middle Ages, like Dan Brown, the best-selling author of How Not to Write a Sentence in the English Language, you want to exoticize female spiritual figures and make it out like they're all crypto-pagans who want to sneak in little Easter eggs about
So true.
all these things, and like they're
Mary Magdalene and the
Right,
yeah,
like-
Defenders of Christ, yeah.
every one of them is subversive, whatever. But there are many people like Catherine of Siena or Teresa of Avila who would be seen as just as, let's say orthodox. So kind of like the dividing line between if we view them as orthodox and heterodox, I don't know if it would view, you could find equal numbers male and female on different sides. So I don't know. So kind of like with that in mind, what would you say would be distinctive about a female view of theology in the Middle Ages? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
At Post University, you will have educators and advisors springing into action to provide you with personal support. Because whatever your goals, whether you're online, on campus, or both, support means everything. See how support is helping people like you succeed and start your path now at post.edu/support. That's post.edu/support.
You're a man with a plan.
I know.
You'll propose to her on that family trip in front of everyone. Brilliant.
I know.
You know the trip is only a month away.
But I don't have a ring.
Luckily, there's GageDiamonds.com with engagement rings in every style for every budget with certified natural diamonds, lab-grown diamonds, and moissanite.
Can I finance it?
Gage lets you buy the ring today and pay for it over time with our no credit needed financing.
Brilliant.
Yes, we are. GageDiamonds.com. We're engagements. Middle name.
Exclusions apply.
Many people learn about the history as a collection of names, dates, and places. But history is so much more interesting than that. It's the stories of the men and women who made those places and events matter. It's the story of the farmer in the field as much as it is the story of the man in the Oval Office. I'm Chris from Blogging Through History. Join me as we relive unforgettable historical moments on the Blogging Through History podcast, diving deeper into the forgotten stories of our past. To listen now, search Blogging Through History on your favorite podcast platform.
Gosh, that is such an interesting question. So it's really fascinating you mentioned this idea of Dan Brown and the sacred feminine. As I was writing my book Femina, I was writing another book which is actually targeted at younger readers. It was made in conjunction with British Museum. It's called Goddess, and it's these figures of faith and belief across the globe that have influenced religion now, and it's everything, it's Inuit belief, and it's South American belief, and it's African belief, and I was writing that in conjunction, and it was making me think about this sort of fetishization of the female, which we've increasingly lent into over the last few decades, Dan Brown being kind of one of the prime examples. It's all about fertility and the womb, and that Mary Magdalene is somehow the vessel. I think if you really read your medieval literature, there's an awful lot of that, but it's being said by men and women. For a start, male theologians are fascinated by this idea of the wound of Christ being kind of like the feminine sexual parts and creation, but it's not a uniquely female approach. So even when Julian says God is mother, that is not unorthodox. There are male theologians at the time that are saying exactly the same thing. When we come to this idea of how some women are able to find a theological voice within what is a largely male-dominated environment, the best example to look at, I think, is Hildegard of Bingen. When we begin this journey, as you described, into Teresa of Avila, when we go into Bridget of Sweden, when we go into sort of the real superstar 13th, 14th century mystics, amongst whom we've got Julian, but we've also got Marjorie who is amazing. At that point, in the 14th century, there are options to women of how they're going to lean into theology. Bridget of Sweden, of course, she had 9 children, she was a lay person, she set up the Beguines, the Bridgertines, but she is one of these women who says, yes, I've lived in the real world, but yes, I'm going to talk on matters of Christ. The Lollards, of course, are encouraging that too. Women are allowed to preach within their framework. And then Julian is taking a bit more of an orthodox stand by saying, no, I will go into an enclosed environment and I will then, in that space, think on the matters of God. But the major dividing factor, of course, is that women were excluded from university education. And because they weren't being taught theology the traditional way, because they weren't being taught the rhetorical devices, they weren't being given access to this sort of body of work that later male theologians emulate, they had to find a way to write about the spiritual that was distinct and their own. And that is where the realm of visionaries comes into play. Because if a woman can say they have a direct communion with the divine, they've been visited by saints or they've been visited by Jesus, as in the case of Marjorie, they are then either getting these visions from a divine source or from a demonic source. So at this point, male scribes intervene. You've got fascination at this point with male authors trying to make their name in the writing world by finding this unique visionary that they can capture and that they can record. And so it becomes a bit of a sort of industry, really. These women are celebrities. Women across Western Europe are all dressing in white because that's what Bridget of Sweden did. She's seen as this sort of mega celeb, and other women are trying to be like her. And they're seeing in what she's done a sort of influencer lifestyle choice. Look, it's worked well for her. Maybe we can have a go at it. So there's lots.
Stay in the left 2 lanes.
Different ways to see this growth in female spirituality that's taking place towards the end of the medieval period. And in a way, that is partly why the Reformation is so brutal for women. It is with Martin Luther that we get women's places in the home. They are shut down because right the way through from Hildegard of Bingen in the 11th, 12th century, the Cathars in the 12th, 13th century, up to the 15th century, it's this ever-burgeoning space for women to be heard. And, far from this sort of papist, brutal, dark period, it was actually a time when women could find voices within monastic environments, so, and outside of them. Fascinating when you start to see it that way around,
Yeah, most of the things that we think are negative about the Middle Ages are really Renaissance. Witch trials, all that stuff. Nah, that's not Middle Ages. That's Renaissance. One other thing about Hildegard I want to mention was her role as a scientist, because this is one of, I think, the most criminally underrated aspects of the Middle Ages, the growth of science. We have people trying to build primitive airplanes, like
In 2 miles, take exit 24 on the left to merge onto US 1 South toward I-95 South.
Who goes on a hang glider. He flies, he doesn't land correctly and breaks both of his legs. But you have a massive growth in science that well exceeds what's happening at any time in the Roman Empire, of windmills, of all sorts of mechanical craft, and Hildegard is part of this as well. So can you describe her role and others, females' role in medieval science?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I was trying not to do with my book was make these sorts of bang the drums, these are women you should know about from the past. We've had loads of these books, 50 women that changed the world, 50 women that changed the league. This book was not supposed to be that. This book was supposed to be seeing the medieval period, seeing the past in a different way by framing it up on women. But there is one woman that comes sort of screeching out of this book, and I couldn't help but idolize her, and that's Hildegard of Bingen. I mean, she would have been remarkable in any age. I can't think of a woman today, alive today, that had the breadth of wisdom that Hildegard had. So she was a visionary. Again, her visions, I mean, if we ever try and apply modern scientific approaches to what's going on with these visionaries, with Julian, it seems to have been a near-death experience that brought about her visions. With Marjorie Kemp, it was postnatal depression, severe postnatal depression, and hallucinations as a result. And with Hildegard, it's very clear her visions were caused by migraines, because the way she writes about them, she's present in her body, she's not transported off in a trance-like state. And she talks about scotoma, she talks about these sorts of jagged edges, and almost like metallic edges to her vision, and pulsating colour. and a very clear set of bright colors that radiate outwards. So she begins having visions when she's a child, but she leans into these visions as a means of being able to then develop her own theology. And boy, does she do that. I mean, the front cover of my book is her vision of the cosmic egg, which, I mean, if you just have to read it, it is absolutely out of this world. But what is so amazing is she is absolutely established as orthodox. She has the ear of the Pope. She chastises the Pope. She has the Holy Roman Emperor, the kings and queens of Europe, hanging on her every word. She's known as the Sybil of the Rhine.
Stay in the middle 2 lanes.
She has this sort of public-facing, politically-facing activism, but she's also a musician. I mean, if anyone listening to this podcast does one thing afterwards, go and download some music by Hildegard of Bingen. It's on YouTube, it's on the internet. It is just unlike any other music ever written. Everyone else at the time is writing these sort of Gregorian.
Okay, so we're looking into the mirror now. How do you feel when you look?
A bit confronted, to be honest.
Osman is a very old mate of mine, and he's a little nervous to be on the show.
No, I'm cool. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we are looking at our faces in front of this giant mirror with incredibly bright lights. Tell me what you see when you look at your skin right now.
A few lines, forehead lines. I've had them like when I was maybe just after high school they kind of started and they've always just kind of been there. So with this bloody lighting, Wendy, that's all I could see.
What I could see was this vertical line between my eyes. I call it my science versus crease, because it's this skeptical look.
It's a brown line.
No, skeptical line.
Skeptical line.
But you have it too.
It's a bust that myth line.
Yeah. But then there's science line. But Oz doesn't want to. But then there's science line. He'd like it to gently go away, along with his other fine lines. And he wants some nice skincare to do the work.
Something that doesn't need Botox. You know, I don't want to do any kind of invasive procedures or anything, so it's just skincare that I kind of look to.
For about a decade, Oz has used fancy creams to fight off wrinkles. But now he's getting a bit older. He's in his 30s. And he's wondering if they're doing anything. And that is what we are diving into today. I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. And today on the show, we are pitting facts against fine lines. As we find out, is there anything you can slap on your face to prevent wrinkles, and if you've already got them, to make them go away?
I have no idea. Wendy, tell me.
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just to see what's in these anti-aging creams.
You go, let's go.
Okay, I'll put my shoes on. Oz and I headed to this department store in Sydney.
So we're in the store.
I reckon we can go.
And went straight to the skincare section, which was huge. All the big brands were there. You know, the ones with the Frenchy sounding names. And they were all promising one thing. The thing Oz wants, the thing I want.
Visibly corrects lines and wrinkles.
Stronger, younger looking skin.
Youth generating power. Proven anti-aging efficacy.
Visibly diminishes lines and wrinkles. Oh, can you read this one?
Tender and bouncy.
And some of these creams were pricey. One small jar was $2,000.
What could they possibly be putting in there to justify that?
Jargon.
I'm supposed to be the skeptical one.
What are they putting in these products? We saw the same stuff over and over again.
Retinol skin renewing.
This one also has retinol.
Retinol, even I'd heard of that. Collagen, vitamin C,
Hyaluronic acid.
There it is, big sign, hyaluronic acid. I feel like we're not doing enough now. I feel like there's a whole world out there with all these skincare products. There's got to be some basis behind it, right?
Right? That's what we're getting to the bottom of today. And even if you're not into skincare and wrinkles, stick around. Because it turns out the science of trying to engineer a fountain of youth is very fun. When it comes to skincare, there's a lot of promises that our skin will be
tender and bouncy.
But then there's science. dose of skincare is coming up just after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
Variety says Shucked is the surprise delight of the Broadway season, nominated for 9 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. The Wall Street Journal says Shucked is hilarious. Today.
Welcome back. Today we're ironing out the wrinkles in the billion-dollar skincare industry to find out if there's anything we can put on our skin to prevent wrinkles or make those lines we've already got disappear. And I found the perfect person to help us with this.
You wrote an entire book on this topic.
Yes, I did.
This is Dr. Natalia Spearings, a dermatologist who works with the King's College Hospital, London. And the first thing I wanted to ask her is, when you look deep in our skin, what's changing as we get older? Like, why do we get wrinkles? And she said a lot of this comes down to proteins in our skin, like elastin and collagen. They're sort of like scaffolding that give our skin structure. And when we're younger, that scaffolding works really well.
So in a younger person, the collagen looks more nicely lined up. Like the sheets are all nice in a row. You know, everything looks ordered and the elastin is there and it's all nicely figured, you know, in a little arrangement. And it looks pretty.
But as we age, it all gets a bit wonky.
There's less collagen and it's all a bit like morphed, and there's less elastin, and the elastin that is there doesn't function properly. That's why baby skin is always so smooth and older people's skin is a little more rough because of that change in structure.
Because all the scaffolding underneath is messed up.
Yeah, it gets all screwed up.
This happens thanks to time, you know, just the beautiful process of aging. But it's also because of the sun. UV rays can penetrate into the skin, damaging that elastin and collagen. And if you want to know what sun damage can do to your skin, then go to the mirror, pull down your pants, and look at your butt.
Because people generally don't expose their butts to sun ever. That skin is always going to be smoother, softer. It doesn't have any age spots.
I have been looking at my bottom and then looking at my face, and I'm like, wow, that skin damage is real.
Yeah, yeah, the skin damage is real. So, of course it is, yeah. So that's your baby skin. That's what your skin would look like if you never went in the sun, ever. So that's what you're trying to get back to.
We sure are. So, how do I get back to my baby butt skin? But on my face. And we want to know if we could do it with a cream or serum. Like, is it even possible? And it turns out that for any ingredient in your skin cream to get deep into the skin and fix up that screwed up scaffolding, it has to go on an epic journey. Which starts at the foot of a basically impenetrable fortress. The top layer of our skin. Or as the nerds call it, the stratum corneum.
So this stratum corneum is the biggest barrier, and for good reasons.
Here's Dr. Sue Wong, a pharmacist at Keele University in the UK. And Sue told us that this layer of skin is there to prevent crap in the environment getting into your body. It's our first line of defense.
A sign of very good, healthy skin is that you have a very good barrier. But quite ironically is that obviously that if you want to introduce something, that it needs to overcome this barrier.
And getting past this barrier is formidable. It's made of cells that are tightly layered together like a brick wall. And squished between those cells is fat. That's like the mortar. So if you are a molecule inside a skincare product, how do you bust through?
So you as a molecule, you can diffuse directly through that layer of bricks, just like a ghost walking through a wall, I suppose. Okay? Or you can actually follow the mortar.
And that is what a lot of chemicals try to do. Sneak in through the mortar, which is made of fat, right? So to get through, you need to be fat soluble. If you are water soluble, forget about it. And right there, a bunch of skincare products are already out of the game. Like one popular skincare ingredient, vitamin C. You might read about how it's a powerful antioxidant, sucks up stress in your skin. Yeah, well,
It's definitely water soluble, yes.
and we need to be fat soluble to pass the barrier.
Yes.
Then it's not getting in. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Even scientists at L'Oreal acknowledge that garden variety vitamin C can't really penetrate your skin. Okay, so being fat soluble. That is step number 1. Another thing?
You want to be a very, very small molecule. So the smaller the better, in fact.
One reason for this is because the space between the cells that you are trying to squeeze through is teeny tiny. And because of this hurdle, a whole batch of ingredients in your favorite skincare products are out. Like collagen, it's too big. There's some evidence that it might help if you ate it as a supplement, but applied to the skin, no dice.
Use the left 2 lanes to take exit 24 on the left to merge onto US 1 South toward I-95 South.
Acid, another super popular skincare product, is out too. In fact, here's how Natalia described the idea of getting garden variety hyaluronic acid in a cream past our top layer of skin.
It's like squeezing an elephant through a cat flap. That's exactly what you're trying to do. It's never going to happen. So...
And I asked Sue, if these fancy ingredients, like hyaluronic acid, aren't penetrating deep into my skin to where the wrinkles are, what are they doing?
It's pretty much just gonna sit on the surface. To be honest, I think every time you wash your face, you're just washing it off. So
Get around this fact that some ingredients are just way too big to penetrate the skin or are water soluble. Researchers have tried to do things like use shrunken down molecules or put them in different suspensions, like fancy gels that kind of makes them fat soluble. And Sue reckons it is possible that these souped up chemicals might do something.
Exit left.
But the studies in this space don't tend to be very good quality. Like often they don't even use placebo controls. And then even if you do manage to get some very special formulation of something, like say, let's go back to vitamin C, well then you run into other problems. Like vitamin C is notoriously unstable. Those fancy serums that you get, they often come in glass bottles, right? But vitamin C breaks down when it's exposed to light. And that's not all.
to be honest, I'll be more worried if you're exposing it to air. There's a tendency for it to oxidize.
So what happens if it gets oxidized?
Okay, so essentially the moment it's oxidized, it loses its antioxidant properties.
Oh. And you can actually see this happening in your bottle at home when the stuff inside starts to go brown.
In half a mile, keep right to merge onto I-95 South toward George Washington Bridge.
Done by a skincare company, tried to put vitamin C inside this hoity-toity optimized emulsion to stop it from breaking down. And even then, after a month of living in a glass tube exposed to some oxygen, about a third of the vitamin C was gone. A third. Basically, every time we use our droppers to release some vitamin C serum onto our skin, air gets in, and a vitamin C angel loses its wings. I talked to Oz about this.
It's being contaminated by air.
Yes.
I'm shocked. I'm shocked. I shouldn't be shocked, but I'm a little bit shocked.
So bottom line, it's just incredible. an ingredient to go from being slopped on to deep down where all that screwed up scaffolding is. And I know we didn't go through all the ingredients that you see out there, from CoQ10 to all those peptides. But one big review paper on this said that the scientific evidence for a lot of these products is, quote, scarce. And I just wouldn't trust a lot of the stuff you read on these bottles. Like several years ago, the consumer protection watchdogs in the US, the FTC, started looking into some of L'Oreal's claims. They'd advertised that some of their products boost the activity of genes, giving us visibly younger skin in just a week. But when the FTC dug into L'Oreal's evidence to back that stuff up, they concluded the claims were, quote, false or misleading. And the two parties settled. But never fear. Don't give up hope just yet. Because after the break, we find one thing that really might pass the science versus test here. And we'll meet someone who played one big trick on the skincare industry.
It feels so naughty, but it's so fun because you go, well, if the big guys can do this, little old me can do it too.
Coming up. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon-neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share. Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Hey, Wendy here. Would you own a pit bull? 51% of our listeners said yes. 15% already have one.
Use the left lane to keep right to merge onto I-95 South toward George Washington Bridge.
A job interview. And when asked, would you donate your turds to science? I am very happy to say that 2/3 of you said yes. So did I. Each week on Science Versus, we're asking you very important questions. To join in the fun, just head to our latest episode, scroll down, and you'll see our questions right there. So, your turds, yes or no?
If it seems like there are a lot of people quitting their jobs right now, it's because they are.
We're working so hard that we forgot to think about what makes us happy.
I would just sit at my desk and cry.
I just got to the point where I had to say, I don't know if I can do this.
And it's not just quitting. There's a lot of unusual things happening in the economy. Car shortages, soaring lumber prices, inflation. We cover all this and more on the Journal podcast, out every weekday afternoon. Tap now to listen to the Journal on Spotify.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from The Ringer, and this is a podcast called The Rewatchables. We have been doing it really since 2017. It started.
Keep right, then keep left to merge onto I-95 South toward George Washington Bridge upper level.
Most rewatchable scene, who won the movie, Apex Mountain, what age the best. But here's the thing, if you want the full archive, you can hear them only on Spotify for free, by the way. So make sure to follow the
Use the left lane to keep left to merge onto I-95 South toward George Washington Bridge upper level.
Welcome back. Today we're asking whether you can put something on your skin to stop wrinkles. And much like those tanning beds in the 90s, we just roasted a whole lot of skincare products. Oh, stop it. But now, we're going to look at one of the most common chemicals that people put on their skin to prevent wrinkles. Vitamin A creams. There's a few different versions out there. The one that a lot of you probably know is retinol. And then there's the prescription version.
Keep left.
Or tretinoin or tret. Here's Natalia again.
They are a huge market. They're
In 1.6 miles, take exit 74 to merge onto Palisades Interstate Parkway North toward Palisades Parkway.
crazy. And patients really believe that they can do something.
So, can they? Let's start by diving into the prescription stuff. Tret. It's mostly used for acne, and it works for that. But studies going back decades have tested to see if this can help with our wrinkles too. They do stuff like get people to put tretinoin on their skin for months, take biopsies of their skin and look at it under powerful microscopes. And after all that, they find that for some people,
You have increased collagen and elastin in the dermis.
well, you actually see more collagen in the dermis, in that lower layer.
Yeah, so tretinoin basically it helps stop the degradation of collagen and elastin.
So this is exciting, right? Finally, we have a product that is getting down to our wrinkles and actually doing something. And when it comes to preventing wrinkles before they happen, while there's not a lot of research in this space, some studies do suggest that it might help with that as well. But before you head to the doctor for a prescription, let's find out how much of a difference this stuff can make. Like, will it make me look like I'm 21 again? Well, in the US, there's a version of Tret that's approved by the FDA to get rid of wrinkles. It's called Renova. And instead of looking at our fine lines, let's look at the fine print, how well this product works. Okay, so the FDA approved Renova off the back of studies involving more than 500 people with lighter skin. Half of them used tretinoin on their face for around 6 months. And afterwards, they looked to see whether their skin had improved or not. Now, in most of the people who took Tret, you either couldn't see any improvement, or it was pretty small. In fact, only 10% of the Tret group had a moderate improvement to their fine lines. Here's Natalia.
When I was reading these studies, I was surprised at how small the effect was.
Right.
10% is not a lot. Like, no, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but it's not magic.
It sure ain't magic. Even for those who saw a benefit, it only seemed to help with their fine wrinkles.
So, nothing else, only fine lines.
How fine are we talking?
Pretty fine. Yeah, so as in like the lines that you perhaps can very slightly see around your eyes when you're not smiling.
Right.
Like the very faint, you have to kind of look carefully. Like a very fine line.
It's when you are having a bad day and you look in the mirror for a really long time and you're like, oh, I'm not 21 anymore. Those lines, right?
Yeah. Yes, and they're very kind of older fine, as opposed to
Use the right lane to take exit 74 to merge onto Palisades Interstate Parkway North toward Palisades Parkway.
or more static lines, which are thicker, deeper, like crevices in the skin.
Those crevices, aka my skeptical frown line, Tret isn't touching that. One of the earliest studies into tretinoin noted this, writing, quote, lax, sagging, deeply wrinkled skin is beyond the repair of these creams.
Take the exit.
And the thing is, in those studies I just told you about with Renova, they all had
In 7.7 miles, take exit 2 toward Alpine and Gloucester.
skin. There have been some studies in people from Asia using tretinoin for wrinkles, and it does seem to help. But when the company making Renova did a trial in about 100 people with darker skin, Tret didn't seem to help. In fact, more people in the control group who were not using Tret said their skin had improved. There is some evidence from other research that tretinoin can reduce hyperpigmentation or sunspots in people with darker skin, but it also might lighten skin. There are also some well-known side effects of using Tret. Like during the first few months, it can increase your sensitivity to sunlight, upping the risk that you'll get sunburn. And when you first put it on, it's pretty common to get a bit of a reaction, which in some cases can be kind of intense.
Like just red flaky skin, you put makeup on, it's stingy, you can see the flakes, like just very irritated skin.
Okay, so that is the prescription grade vitamin A that you need to get from your doctor. But then there's all these vitamin A products that you can just buy over the counter, like retinol. Oz and I saw a ton of these in store. Pure red
retinol skin renewing.
Retinol. These are cousins of tretinoin. They don't tend to irritate your skin as much. But it also seems that they don't do anything for wrinkles. Well, this is what Natalia concluded after looking at a bunch of clinical trials of over-the-counter retinol. Trials which used an objective way to measure wrinkles, see if they literally get more on this stuff. And they didn't really. Natalia published what she found in a peer-reviewed journal.
This is the best paper I've ever written, ever.
It was sassy and informative.
A bit bitchy. A little bit bitchy at the end, but I was like, God damn it.
And just so you know, when it comes to academia, here's what bitchy sounds like. Natalia wrote that, quote, there is very little, if any, trustworthy evidence available to support the use of retinol-containing products to improve the appearance of aged skin. End quote. Also, out of an abundance of caution, it's not recommended to take any of these vitamin D creams if you're pregnant. Natalia calls it like she sees it. She says with over-the-counter creams that have retinol in them,
I think they are a total waste of time.
yeah, a total waste of time.
Right. I would not bother. Totally. Yeah.
Bottom line, over-the-counter vitamin A creams? Well, you better like it. But I asked Natalia, who has light skin, whether she uses the prescription stuff.
Do you use tretinoin? Yes, I do. So because it's the best we have, and it's the only thing we have that has any kind of solid evidence base behind it, yes, absolutely use tretinoin.
Okay, so our final question is, if it's so hard to make skincare cream that really works, why does it seem like every product on the shelf is? Like, if you look at an ad for skincare, there are all these stats they bust out about how well these products work. Oz and I saw them in the store.
Now, skin to confirm 89% of women agree. 52% for smoothness.
Minus 21% fine line.
91% agree skin feels healthy.
You'll often see these claims supported by the words clinically proven.
We did a fit science.
So where are all these science claims coming from? I want you to meet Kirsten Drysdale, a journalist at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who pulled one heck of a stunt to get to the bottom of all this. And in doing so, she was living by her own big life philosophy. Don't buy into the bullshit.
I just feel like we are surrounded in this world by bullshit. And people fall for it all the time. It just drives me crazy.
So, a few years ago, when Kirsten was working on a TV show called The Checkout, I was working on it too, that's how we know each other, she and her producer reached out to a lot of big skincare companies to ask, we noticed you said 96% of people found this improved their skin. What is that test based on? Who conducted it? How was it conducted? She also looked through industry magazines and ultimately worked out that there's this collection of companies that big skincare brands pay to run some of their clinical trials. But Kirsten wasn't too sure how much she could trust the science that they were putting out. So, for example, one company, which is called Spin Control.
I know, I was like, is this a joke? You have actually called yourself Spin Control.
Kirsten read a quote from the site.
Our aim is to perform studies as close as possible to your consumer's target.
So, I mean, that's what they're saying there, is they design their tests to validate the marketing claims that you have already made. That's backwards science. That's not how testing is supposed to work.
In 2 miles, take exit 2 toward Alpine and Gloucester.
Doing the tests first, seeing what the product can do, and then making claims based on that. Not reverse engineering an experiment to so-called prove your claims.
We reached out to Spin Control to ask them about all this. They didn't get back to us. Okay, so when Kirsten was looking at all this, it just seems so bizarre. Like, could you really just give one of these companies any cream and then say it was great? There was one way to find out.
Well, we thought if they can do it, why can't we? So we went and bought the cheapest moisturizer we could find. So like a said, we've got a new face cream product that we're about to launch, and we'd like to get some clinical trials to back our marketing plan.
They paid £2,000 to a company called Aspen Clinical Research, who agreed to send out the cream to 100 people, get them to use it for 3 weeks, and then
Use the right lane to take exit 2 toward Alpine and Gloucester.
say about their experience.
You feel so naughty, but it's so fun because you go, well, if the big guys can do this, that little old me can do it too. I just got a bit nervous that maybe they would see through the fact.
Take the exit, then turn right onto Alpine Approach Road toward Gloucester. Turn right onto Alpine Approach Road toward Gloucester, then turn left onto US 9W.
Nobody would really like it, but the results came back and they were 5-star.
Tested, whipped out the report they sent her, and we went through it.
At the light, turn left onto US 9W.
Reduction in the look of lines and wrinkles, 98%.
98%!
98%.
And then what's the next one?
Well, the next one, this was just, you know, a swish. 100%. My skin feels more youthful.
That is wild.
100%. That's how good our product was. So, yeah, these are just meaningless numbers. Completely meaningless numbers.
After you did all this work, did it change how you look at these skincare ads?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I already, you know, I wasn't the kind of person that would pay them that much attention, but in a moment of vulnerability, I could see myself in a supermarket aisle going, oh yeah, that one looks legit.
In 3/4 of a mile, turn right onto Gloucester Dock Road.
My trust has been destroyed now. Totally destroyed.
We're not sure how these companies get these kinds of results. We reached out to Aspen Clinical Research to ask about this, but didn't hear back.
At the next light, turn right.
So who knows? It could be the placebo effect. Or perhaps because as soon as you put any old moisturizer on your skin, it can feel a little nicer. Moisturizers work, not because they're putting moisture deep into your skin.
At the light, turn right onto Gloucester Dock Road.
There's a barrier. So all the time that you've been listening to this podcast, water in your skin has been evaporating into the air. And a lot of moisturizers work because they sit on your skin, making it harder for water to leave.
In 2.5 miles, turn left onto High Street.
I talked to Sue about this.
So for most moisturizers, all that you're really doing is putting that layer of oil on top of the skin that prevents this water loss. So your skin does look more hydrated.
Other stuff in bog standard moisturizers is designed to just sit on top of your skin and kind of fill in wrinkles. So it does make your skin look a bit nicer while it's on, but then it'll just rub off. And it probably doesn't matter what kind of moisturizer you use. Like one study of 80 Swedish women were randomized to get either expensive cream or cheap stuff, and after 6 weeks, there were no differences when it came to reducing wrinkles or making skin feel younger or more beautiful. So where does this leave us? If you want your skin looking youthful and healthy, what can you do? Well, remember how we talked about how awesome that skin on your butt is? Because it barely sees any UV rays? Well, that means that before wrinkles set in, or to prevent bigger ones from forming, the only thing that comes in a bottle that you really need is sunscreen. One big study randomized almost 1,000 people, getting some to use sunscreen every single day, and others just when they wanted it. And after 4.5 years, the daily sunscreen group's skin barely changed, unlike the other group, who were more likely to have gotten wrinkles.
Yes. So, sunscreen.
It's Natalia.
But aside from that, there is nothing that is essential skincare.
And Natalia has gotten some backlash for telling
never gonna end. Like, we're gonna have a new skincare product every day for the rest of our lives.
We're gonna do all this work, debunking, and then tomorrow they're gonna be like, new product out, centrifuge. That's what you gotta put on your skin.
This comes from the serum of a tortoise from some island in the Galapagos.
That spins very fast.
Like, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, because there's this hope. We all want to look our best. We all want to look young, and I totally understand that. But they're preying off our insecurities and making us believe that we need to do all this crap so we can look good, when actually you don't, and you look fine just the way you are.
What's so bad about having a couple of wrinkles, right?
Here's Sue again.
Just shows that you've lived a life, you know, and you know, what's so bad about that?
I talk to Oz about everything I've learned. But when it comes to the stuff we put on our skin, nothing's really gonna make it tender and bouncy like it used to be. We just gotta keep putting sunscreen on and hope for the best.
Wow, okay, that's so interesting. Okay. What do we do, Wendy? How do we live in? We can't go outside anymore.
I know, we just have to be happy with our faces.
We do, okay. Okay, that's interesting. This is a lot to take in. You seem distraught, huh? I am distraught. All that money for nothing, Wendy. It's a scam, Wendy. It's a scam. Sounds like total bullshit. It is. It is, Wendy. And I'm like, oh.
That's science versus.
Wendy, how you doing?
I'm good. Oz, I'm almost finished the skincare episode, but there's one more thing to do. I have to tell you how many citations are in this week's episode.
How many, Wendy?
Okay, there's 100 citations in this.
there a bench still inside over there, or no? They took the benches out.
There's still benches.
Okay, I'll go in later to watch you. I'm tired of the city.